welcome to Darkhourparanormallive. I am your host, Michael Roser, and I'm not alone tonight. In fact, sitting with me, I have my very good friend, colleague, Dr. J, making live, here to discuss a very particular individual that, I'll be honest with you, I've known for a very long time. His case is well beyond what we're familiar with in terms of any story of something or otherwise. And tonight we're going to be having a conversation that is down to something that we're talking about and discovering, researching, and still picking up the consequence of in terms of experience with my guest tonight, Dr. Johnathan Reed. Now, I'm going to introduce Dr. J to all of you in just a moment, but one of the reasons that I wanted to bring Dr. Johnathan Reed on is, again, his case is probably the most prominent that I'm aware of in this whole arena of ufology. Now, what makes his case a lot different is that, number one, he may have acted a little bit differently to, the duress and the stress of going through the experience that he's going to share. But within that, he was able to document a very large portion of what he had gone through, even in that very defining moment where all of this began and became a landslide for the path that was the rest of his life. Now, we have other people out in the field who have talked about having connections or coming across an extraterrestrial or some sort of terrestrial being that is not familiar to us and sort of seems to defy science in not only appearance, but the entirety of what that being is. And again, many of these folks, they walk away with the experience, they have the anecdotal to back on, and at the same time, they don't have anything evidential, nothing tangible that we can hold in our hand. So back to why Dr. Johnathan Reed's case is so different, he has that evidence. And I don't mean just one bit. We're talking different angles, biological, negatives from the film. I mean, an actual artifact that he has displayed and presented on national television. So this is a very different case, folks. You are in for one hell of a ride tonight. And if you're not familiar with this case, you will be by the end of this interview. And I implore you to go into some of the other interviews that Dr. Johnathan Reed has done, specifically going to Dr. J's channel, as he has interviewed him over 3 separate times, and every single one of those interviews are unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. Both gentlemen did a fantastic job conveying what was there to be spoken about, and of course, all of this is now locked in to archives that you can visit and enjoy. All right, before we get things kicked off here, I want to say hello to everyone in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us all. As you know, when we have guests like this on, I will get to the chat as we can, but please put your questions in capital letters. Both Dr. J and myself will be watching the chat and responding to those accordingly. So, folks, if you're not familiar with Dr. J Radio Live, let me give you a little background here. This particular individual has had so much time, not only in the field of esoterics, but in radio as well. It's unbelievable the tenure that he has under his belt. Those notches go from here to Timbuktu. He was he was Art Bell's producer. And of course, with all the connections that go into that, as a right-hand man, he is the person you would think he would be. And we're talking a legendary status here. I mean, it is an absolute honor. I know he's a great friend of mine. I'm very close to him, but I don't forget who he is in this field and what he's offered us throughout the years. It's my absolute pleasure, folks, to introduce to you my best friend and yours, Dr. J Radio Live, coming in right now. How we doing, Dr. J? Thanks so much for being here tonight and experiencing this interview along with myself and Dr. Johnathan Reed tonight.
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here. For those who can't see me, look what happens when I turn on the camera. So for technical reasons, I was told to leave it on that. So that should solve that question. Thank you, Mike. This will be a super fantastic interview because honestly, if I can have a quick moment to talk about Dr. Johnathan Reed, I've interviewed everybody and people who's above everybody, right? The point is, I don't put my name behind every case. Now, I give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I don't think people who have some traumatic experience, whether it be an abduction or a sighting, why would they really lie, right? But for the most part, most people, I believe, are telling the truth. This case not only is someone telling the truth. There is physical evidence to back this case up. I always say the two most important types of case to investigate are crash and retrieval and alien abduction and contact. The reason you want to talk to contactees and abductees is because they can tell you about the aliens, what they look like, what their skin feels like, how they communicate, how they move. Crash and retrieval gives us the nitty gritty. We get the actual pieces, we get the wreckage, we get artifacts. Well, there may not have been a crash in Dr. Reed's case, but we have a working alien artifact. So let me say this. By far, this is the most important case in ufology, and it proves everything.
Absolutely, 100%. Everything that Dr. J Radio Live had just said is accurate. And of course, we are incredibly excited to revisit this once again with you. So without further ado, as they say here, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Johnathan Reed.
Hello. Thank you for taking the time to let me come and share with you my experience. I really appreciate it.
Dr. Johnathan Reed, thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your busy life in one shape or form, whatever that looks like, just to come and talk to us about this. We understand that there's a lot of significance in what you went through. And, we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that this was never a focus for you prior to this experience, and the effect that it's had on your life and other lives that are surrounded with you, because again, there is a parallel here that we can certainly identify with when we talk about figures such as Phil Schneider, for example, who basically went the distance and would tell us that the government was after him, they're trying to kill me. And Dr. Johnathan Reed, you have absolutely dealt with some of this as well, and we're going to get into the thick and thin.
And Bob Lazar, he has very similar instances to Bob Lazar.
Yes, and and the most significant part about this is that you are still with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, many times people come to me, especially with a case like this, to say, well, they never missed twice kind of thing, but they did with Phil Schneider. What was it, 13, 14 times? So yeah, obviously, whoever's trying to come after us and quell something like this can have folly as well. And thank God that they do, because obviously, again, you are still with us. So with that in mind, Dr. J, would you like to get us up and running here? I know you have some questions as well as I do. Let's get on it, my friend.
Well, before we get to that fateful day in 96, why don't you give us a couple sentences about who you were and then jump into what exactly you were doing when you were walking Susie out in the woods?
Okay, well, it's a long story, and I'm going to try to make it as short as possible. And I appreciate everyone's questions, good, bad, or indifferent, because that's what this is all about. I want the ability to tell what happened to me. And I always tell everybody this in the beginning. If I hadn't have seen it and experienced it, seen the evidence, and been able to actually live it, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But nevertheless, it happened. I was a medical doctor, developmental psychiatrics, child development. I graduated from San Diego State University, UCLA, and the University of Washington with a degree in psychiatric care. I worked at the University of Washington Medical Center for 10 years, actually 11 years. And this came to a crashing halt when I experienced this situation on October 15th, 1996. I know that's a long time ago, but and I've had to live it every day ever since. But it was not something that was in my paradigm. It was not something that I was interested in. I was what you would call a skeptic. I didn't have time for anything to do with this subject, nor science fiction. I really wasn't interested. I was a scientist. I was a medical doctor. So my life was full doing that. On that day, I decided to take the half a day off and go for a hike with my dog, Susie, 7-year-old golden retriever. We had done this many times in this same area. It was about an hour away from my home. We drove east to the mountains, Snoqualmie area, and parked my car, got out, actually parked my Jeep and got out and started walking. We walked for about an hour, and my dog took off running, chasing something, which wasn't unusual. Dogs do that. They chase squirrels and raccoons and everything else. But she took off running and was out of sight. There's a lot of underbrush in this area, so you can hear your dog, but you may not be able to see them exactly at the moment, and that's what was happening in this case. So I listened to where she was. I could hear her barking clearly, but her barking started to change. When you have a dog, you learn to understand their voice, the sound of their barking. Well, her barking changed. It changed to be offensive, like she was being hurt or mauled by an animal. Well, in this area, we have bear and we have wildcats and even mountain lions, and they can grab a dog and literally scare it into death in a cornered situation. And I thought this may be happening, so I picked up a large baseball-sized branch that was on the ground. Some people call it a stick, but it was a branch, like a club. And I picked that up in case I had to untangle her from whatever she was up against. And again, I couldn't see her, but I kept running up the path closer and closer to where her sound was. And all of a sudden, I kind of jumped down into a thicket, and I was face to face with this creature, this small, dark creature. The tree canopy was extremely heavy, and it was an overcast day, but I could see that it had 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, and it was grabbing my dog by the neck and throwing my dog back and forth like she weighed nothing. And in that instant, my dog began to die, literally having her throat and her back torn off of her head right in front of me, screaming while she was dying. And all I could think of was I wanted it to stop. So I grabbed this club and I hit it as hard as I could in the head and knocked it down. And it stopped, and it was bleeding, and its skull was breached, and there was blood everywhere. And I didn't think about this. I didn't have time to think about it. I acted out of just raw emotion, terror. Because if I would have had time to think, I would have probably run the other way. But I didn't. I tried to save my dog, but my dog was gone. And that's how I first.
Suggestion real quick, Mike. While he's telling this, can you play the video?
Yes, I certainly can.
Play the one that he's in the forest. Literally after he hit the Freddy, as Susie was killed. By the way, folks, Susie's his dog, and we'll get to Freddy later. But that's the nickname of the creature.
Golden Retriever.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Dr. Reed, but
no, fine. Please interrupt.
Okay.
Here, I'm gonna just put on mute.
Only when it's necessary. No problem. Yeah, mute it for sure as he could talk.
This video was taken about an hour after I hit the creature, knocked him in the head, broke his skull open. You can even see the blood coming out of its head. And it laid motionless for hours. And I mean, I couldn't see it breathing. I couldn't see it moving. So I assumed it was dead.
That's what I actually thought.
The second that I hit it, I also fell to the ground in tremendous shock. My system, my body, it was like something hit me at the same moment. I couldn't breathe. I could barely inhale and exhale fast enough to stay coherent. I lost all control of my bowels and my bladder. I was a mess. I fell to the ground. I had no muscle control at all. And like I said, about an hour after this, I realized I had my camera, and I thought, okay, I'm going to take pictures of this, because I didn't even believe what was going on. And I basically convinced myself, take the pictures to prove to myself that none of this happened. I was trying to talk myself out of what was going on. And I was afraid. I was in shock, going in and out of shock. I mean, people say, oh, well, you were really courageous. Well, I wasn't. Was only trying to survive this situation as best I could. And under the circumstances, I had no idea what was happening. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what was going on. My 1 second, my dog was there in the hands of this little 4-foot tall creature. And the next thing I saw was my dog falling to the ground in powdery ash, a white powdery ash. And nothing made any sense. This defied every kind of logic that I could ever imagine. So I'm taking these pictures thinking, you know, what is this? This thing was making a sound, this black diamond-shaped object that was approximately 12 feet by 3.5 feet by 2.5 feet wide. And I estimated that size because later on we took pictures of me and in the same area and used that as a ruler to estimate the size. This thing never moved. It was hovering 3 feet off the ground, but it making a tone, a low ebbing harmonic sound that rattled the inside of my body. I could almost feel it in my back. And when I walked up close to it, I kind of fell against it. And when I touched it, it made a different sound. It changed its harmonic tone. And it was cold like dry ice. It was black like marble, but it could not be moved. It was anchored to the air. No matter what I did, no matter how much I pushed on it or crawled around it, I tried every way possible to move it, but it wouldn't move, not a fraction of an inch. And this is what I saw. This is where it all happened. And after taking this video and taking some more pictures with my still camera, I was an amateur photographer, so I always had a camera with me. And I took 35 millimeter pictures, still pictures with film and some slide film that I had. I took everything I had. And it gave me some comfort in working the cameras because I knew what I was doing. That gave me some solace to look at something that made sense. So taking the pictures was a twofold operation. I'm not sure if you can understand that, but
that's curious. It's a different approach than what most people are doing when they have the experience. In many cases, they whip out a camera to verify this to others. But in your case, you were kind of doing that for yourself.
Exactly. And I was doing it to not go into total shock because at the time, my mind was whirling in a tornado of misunderstanding. I had no idea what this was. Mm-hmm. I had no idea what was going on. What had killed my dog was laying on the ground that didn't make any logical sense to me. And I mean, I even at first, after seeing it laying dead on the ground, I thought maybe it was a mask and it was a child. So it was childlike in size, but I realized it wasn't a child. It was this small being that was covered from neck to toe in a spandex type tight material suit without any seams, without any separation. It covered its feet totally, 100%.
When you were out there in the woods, obviously you're there to enjoy yourself, you know, taking this leisurely walk with your dog. Initially, let me put it this way. When I first heard this case, you know, there were some details that have been obviously clarified since you were out there hunting. It was a crash site. You know, knowing what you know now, before I go into the larger question that this sort of leads into, knowing what you know now about this entity and the purpose that it may have had to be in that space and for you to cross paths, what is your opinion on this, you know, so many years later, as to why this being was there, and perhaps the others that may have been cadavers or what have you.
Well, I know now, after spending the last 28 years in contact, I realize that there is an agenda and that there was a purpose to all this. Now, initially, I didn't think about that. I was just trying to survive. I was literally trying to slow my breathing down and be able to maintain myself, to be able to get out of the forest. Because this, happened at 2:58 in the afternoon, and it was going to get dark soon. And I was worried about getting out of there in one piece. I mean, I felt like I was going to die when this happened initially.
Dr. Reed, one thing the audience is not able to hear is the distress that you're actually feeling.
That's right. Let me play a little bit of that while we're up here, because that is incredibly significant. And I'm going to pull it back just a little bit, everyone.
Play for it, because I want to finish what I was going to say to him. But people need to hear how seriously distressed. And by the way, folks, what you're seeing, the camera screwing up there, the fuzziness, I believe is part of the electromagnetic interference. And we can get into that in a second, too.
Okay, so here is the same video with the volume.
Yeah.
Again, you can really hear the distress. And this is not pain.
It's sad to hear, isn't it? It's so sad to hear.
Getting sick. I mean, it's hard to watch because you can actually feel Dr. Reed's emotions.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Reed, two things that are in this photo or the video that we want you to ask you about is, first of all, you obviously will get to taking the body home, but wasn't there a bracelet on the ground? And secondly, a lot of people are going to notice this, what looks like a craft very similar to what was in Rendlesham, literally floating off the ground silently, but you don't call it a craft. Can you describe what that is, about 15, 20 feet back away from the body?
like I said, I called it the obelisk because it reminded me in some respects of the top of the Washington Monument, but laying on its side, almost like a marquee diamond shape. It had 6 sides, 6 individual sides, no seams, no rivets, no windows, no doors, no wheels, just one piece of almost like carved black marble.
Kind of like 3D printed, maybe?
No. It was
back then. That wasn't a common thing, and
it was much bigger than people. In some ways, bigger and smaller, both. It was, like I said, approximately 12 to 15 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high. And those dimensions are fairly accurate. Like I said, I used another picture that was later taken after returning to the site of me standing in that exact place and then realizing my body height and using that as a yardstick, more or less, to determine the size.
But something happened when you went close to it, and you call it an anchor. Can you explain to people what happened?
Well, I slipped and kind of fell underneath it, and my hand reached up to grab it, almost to stop myself from falling further, and it grabbed my hand and burned the inside of my hand like dry ice. It was completely frozen like dry ice. I don't know if you've ever touched a piece of dry ice, but it'll stick to your hand. And when you go to pull away, it'll pull the skin right off your hand.
Yeah, and because it burns your hand, and it's
burnt. Oh yeah, and this is what happened. And like I said, the tone that it was generating changed. It changed from a disruptive sound to a more pleasant sound once I touched it. I never called it a craft. Everybody else called it a craft. I thought it was more like a toolbox or a doorway, maybe to give him tools that he needed to do some kind of issue in the forest, in the mountains. Later on, I was able to establish that he was doing basically a geodetic geology survey of something within that area.
Justin has a very good question here. He's curious to know if dimensionally, could the body have fit inside that
Well,
object?
yes, absolutely. When I fell against it, for a brief second, I felt like I was absorbed into something huge, like an airplane hangar.
Oh,
I could
wow.
actually see little tiny lights way, way far in the distance. I didn't know if I was inside something or if I was in the nighttime looking across a distance of water to where I could see these little tiny lights. But that lasted a fraction of a second, and then I was back out. And because it was happening at the same time when I burned my hand touching it, I don't know if that was a sensation that was input or downloaded into me or not. I can't tell. I don't know. And I mean, there's a lot of things I don't have all the answers to. So this is one of those things. But people say, well, could he fit? Yeah, physically, if he would have jammed his legs and arms together, he could have fit the size of a coffin, without any extra expansion to him. But in reality, I don't think it was a craft like you and I think of a space shuttle being a craft. I think this was a situation that was semi, in a way, more so a transitional state, a doorway into possibly
anchor,
another.
Right?
I called it. It was anchored to the air. Absolutely could not be moved a fraction of an inch. I mean, I crawled on the end of it with all my body weight, 220 pounds, and it didn't move, not a fraction. So it never moved. It stayed there the entire time I was there, and when I left, it was still there. Now, the next day, we came back with a friend who was bound and determined he was going to take chains and tow it out of there. It wasn't there. Nothing was there. In fact, all of the plants and ferns that I had removed underneath this thing had been almost like replanted, almost like the time had changed, had reversed before I got there. I mean, incredibly amazing.
With that, in mind, I kind of need to ask you a morbid question just for the sake of conversation. But
I know.
Your dog's cadaver, was that left behind? Was it still there when you went back the next day? Like, what became
there was no body. When it killed my dog fell to the ground in about a 5-foot area from her head to the ground. She fell and became nothing but ash, like ashes from your barbecue. And so was, there really wasn't anything left of her.
That is curious. I mean, we don't even have technology, at least readily, that does that to material. It's especially biological material that's living at the moment of that impact.
Michael, we're talking technology of probably 1 million years beyond us in this current day.
I mean, I've talked to people who are in the higher echelons of the Air Force, at least, and have a reason to kind of point to that faction. But regardless, it used to be, 20, 30 years ago, we were about 100 years ahead in terms of technology militaristically than what the public would have. And this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I asked somebody, again, in that tier, I said, where do we stand now? Are we looking at 300-400 years? And he very much looked at me dead in the eye and he said, we're beyond what you can imagine. I said, well, come on now. That's sort of, an umbrella sort of statement there. I can imagine teleportation, time travel. He's like, yeah, we've been there and done all of that. That's where we are. It's beyond what you can imagine. So it doesn't surprise me that there are people having experiences like yours, Dr. Reed, where you unfortunately have some privy to actually see these technologies in play, and perhaps we are garnering them from certain reconnaissance missions, and I believe that there's truth to that. But yeah, these entities evolve differently in a sense, and yet we follow a natural course as species. There is a parallel there, but yeah, that technology is not something we're familiar with, and of course to have a certain control over gravity, the way that object seemed to display, is just, we know that it's something much different than a craft. I mean, one could certainly make an intellectual deduction and assume that there's much more to this than what meets the eye in that sense.
Well, in that instance, in the woods, when I was having to deal with it face to face, I mean, my mind was reeling to the point where it didn't even want to think about it after a while. I didn't even want to look at it because it bothered me so much that I couldn't figure it out, that I couldn't logically understand the physics to it. It just made no sense at all. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you went in, weren't the dimensions a lot different than the outside?
Yeah, it was huge. Like I said, like an airplane. Like an airplane hangar, right?
Yeah. So what everybody's looking out and seeing, 12, 15, what did you say, 2.5, 3 feet tall, actually turns out to be a football field. Yet it's still all dark, right? Is what you said, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, it was like it made me feel like I was entering a doorway.
Was there a presence in there? Did you sense a presence in there?
Well, the lights that I could see way far in the distance, a couple of them were blinking, and some of them were red and blue, and the rest were white. It was like a horizon of lights, way, way far away, like miles away. And other than that, I felt like I was in a place I shouldn't be. And within that moment, that second of thinking that, I was back consciously outside of this thing, laying on the ground. And again, still not understanding how it was doing what it was doing. How could it be, literally anchored in the air with no physical means of projection or propulsion, making no other sound other than this humming sound? I mean, it was incredible. And I mean, I've had 28 years to think about it. I've talked to people all around the world about it who have seen other things very, very similar, who have told me that they knew only because of the time that they've had to live with this and figure out some of the science, the actual physics to it. I mean, they gave me more information that I could come up with. But I was not a military person. I was not into physics other than what I had learned in college. So it made sense. What people have said since then makes tremendous sense, that this was some kind of a portal or doorway giving this being the ability to come and go without having a ship like we normally would have a ship, or we transport each other by helicopter. Well, this would be using dimension to travel, like a space in dimension. This black doorway could literally be just a doorway for a portal entry and an exit.
Something in between, maybe. Yes.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
I mean, again, going back to your convictions at that moment, we've discussed that most people in this circumstance would pretty much hightail it out of there at the first moment that they realized something was going off.
I would have also. If I could have, I would have. Look, I was scared to death, and with the way my body was being abused, I felt like I was experiencing some kind of radiation sickness. I couldn't catch my breath. My muscles wouldn't move. I couldn't control my bowels or my bladder at all. I mean, it was a mess. I mean, I figured I was going to die within the first hour. I felt that this is what was going to happen to me. And then slowly, I was able to slow down my breathing. And then I realized, oh, I had some water in my day pack. So I crawled up and got to that. That's when I realized I had my cameras, because I had to remove the cameras from my day pack to get to the water. So it was a process. It was just an ongoing process. It wasn't forethought. It wasn't logical. It was, oh, my camera. Yes, I have my camera. I'll drink the water. Then I'm looking at the camera while I'm drinking the water. Yes, I could take a picture. Yes, it probably won't be there, but I could take it. Maybe this is all just a big illusion. Maybe I've lost my mind, but I'll do this because it feels like the right thing to do. So that's why it happened the way it happened. I was trying to survive. My mind didn't want to stick to the subject because it was too hard to conceive. I couldn't rationalize it. And so I would go on to other things that I could rationalize, like the operation of my camera. So when people, people say, oh, these pictures are too good, or they're too accurate. They must be digital. This must have been a digital situation. Well, they weren't. It was 35 millimeter Kodachrome and Kodacolor film, just standard film, a long exposure because of low light situation. I had to lay on the ground and prop my camera up on my two arms like a tripod, and just to get it still enough. It was taken close to a half a second exposure. So, that's how that went. All the film, all the negatives, all the videotape has been analyzed by professionals, including Kodak.
I was just going to say, we actually have a letter from Kodak proving that the negatives are real, they're not tampered with, and everything in the images is what you see. What you see actually happened.
And that letter was not written to me, it was written to Art Bell, who, was the host of the show that I originally went on to talk about this. And he himself contacted Kodak and sent them negatives, my negatives, and they sent him back this verification. So again, step by step, there's an awful lot of evidence proving that the existence of the case happened. And over the years, there's been more and more proof to me that this is an ongoing situation, that this has happened to many people like me, but they just happen to not have a camera, or they didn't have a video recorder with them. I was just the unlucky guy who happened to have all this stuff. And all I can say, I've tried something that people don't realize. There's Art Bell and me in his studio. People don't realize that there's an awful lot of information here that I've gathered over the last 20 years by going around the world and talking to other people who have also had experiences like this. And that's the value of everybody coming together. I've tried to even give away my evidence to other people, other investigators, to seek some kind of understanding better than myself, because I was not a professional researcher. I was a medical doctor. And from time to time, I thought it would be better if somebody else could take this on and do the research and be the spokesman for this. One of those people happened to be Stephen Greer, that initially I contacted and said, I would like to give you everything I have, all of the evidence, all of the information, and let you do whatever you think is best. Because at the time, he was told to me that he was, one of the best, one of the most influential spokesmen.
You also had Wendell Stevens, Robert Dean, and John Mack.
Well, that was later.
Okay.
But I just want to say that you know, Stephen Greer is an interesting person. He has done a lot of good for the overall study by bringing people forward, by bringing a lot of military people forward. But I think he's also missed the boat on a lot of things because he could have had this case, which is one of the strongest cases because of the amount of evidence it has yielded. I mean, not only is there photographs and negatives and videotape, but there's audio tape and there's huge amounts of additional information gathered after we brought the body home. I took samples of its skin, brain material, and blood, and had DNA uh, done with a complete chromosome test done by the head pathologist of the University of Washington. And after seeing all of that information and getting that information, learning what it was, what this physical characteristics of this being was, it's incredible that it had 46 chromosomes, same as humans have, but 9 pairs of them were different and only could be related to sea tortoise and dolphin.
Which is also curious. I'm just going to point this out very quickly because if we go into certain native tribes and their folklore and culture and history, looking at the Dogon tribe in, I believe it's South Africa,
Yes.
they have proposed within their mythology, if you will, that whatever consciousness connected with them so many years ago actually physically manifested as all these different orbs of light that entered the waters, embodied dolphins and whales, which then came and talked to them telepathically. So I don't know if there is some sort of energetic signature that they're more prone to use when it comes to those mammals, of the aquatic nature. But I find continuities within that, talking about some sort of congruence when it comes to an extraterrestrial or some type of entity that holds that vibration, being able to command whatever they're going to do in the physical.
Michael, I think you're absolutely right. It is fascinating. And that same tribe, Dogon, is also called Dogan. If you look into Australia, there's another group of Aborigines that follow that same line. I think that's an interesting thing that their name happens to be almost identical. The other thing I want to say regarding the DNA chromosome study is that if we were, us humans, if we were going to send a probe with a robot out to survey another planet that we couldn't survive on because of whatever adverse conditions, wouldn't it be great if we could build a biological entity that could survive in that environment, that could breathe that atmosphere, that could survive and traverse the ground that it had to be put on to do experimentation and bring back information? Well, we would do the same thing. If we had the ability to create a biological robot that could survive that way, we would do it. And that's what this little guy is. He's actually a biological and he's part biology and part technology that's beyond our ability to understand.
Yeah, like almost like a 3D printed AI being.
Well, even yes, that's a one way of looking at it. But he was grown, just like we would grow a family of dogs or cats or people.
Yes.
But he was grown with a specific talent to do a certain thing in a certain area. He was a biologist and basically a geologist, set out to gather information that he was told to do.
That was his job, essentially.
Exactly. He was created to do this job on this planet. And people don't know completely, but I did bring the body home. Well, after 3 days of the body being in my freezer, I went out to put some things away in my garage. It was in this coffin freezer because I didn't know where else to keep it so it wouldn't disintegrate and degenerate because it was dead. And that was the best thing I could think of. And I was bringing people over to examine the body, to look at it. People I worked with from the University of Washington Medical Center, other doctors, to examine it and help me figure out what all we should do with this. And the one day that I went out there, I was putting things away because the guy couldn't make it to the appointment he had previously set up. So I went out, put a table away, and put some lights away that were in my garage. And all of a sudden, I heard this kind of scratching or rubbing sound. I thought it was the freezer, like it was an older freezer. I thought it was going out, like the compressor was going out on it. And I thought, well, if it's gonna die, I'm going to have to get this body and put it in my refrigerator. You know,
you thought it was dead, so you were going to expect it to stay.
Right. So to check the freezer, I opened the lid to check the thermometer that was inside the lid of the freezer. And as I opened it, this thing sat up out of the thermal blanket that I had wrapped it in and started screaming at me. And the scream was so forceful that it literally forced my body back against the wall of the garage. And I was terrified.
Yeah.
I was terrified that it was going to kill me now. And I just ran out of the garage and ran into the house and slammed the door. And I didn't know what to do. Again, you know, I called a friend of mine who had already come and examined the body and seen it and saw that it was real, knew what was going on, knew that I wasn't insane. And I said, Gary, we got another problem. We got a bigger problem, you know. And he came over and I took him out in the garage. He didn't believe me. And it did the same thing in front of him. Screamed, pushed us back against the wall. And we both ran in the house and just sat there, you know, numb, not knowing what to do.
Well, Doctor, very quickly, if my memory serves me correct, did you actually have an audio recording of that scream? I believe.
Yes. Later on, we were able to make an audio of that scream. I don't have it with me now, but it's out on I think it's out on YouTube somewhere.
I think you can hear it on the Coast to Coast show that you done
yes,
some time ago. That's where I first heard it. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, there's a lot of little pieces to this story that need to be put in order for people to really understand how and when this all happened. I mean, me realizing it was dead initially, and then 3 days later, taking it in and out of the freezer, showing it to people that I worked with, colleagues, my family, friends, and then having it become reanimated, just again, totally, you know, soiled my clothes, to say the least. And you know, unbelievable, totally unbelievable. But nevertheless, there it was. And it was hurt. It just had a big wound in its head, which I kind of duct taped closed because it was flapping back and forth. And I figured it was going to die any moment just from the injury in its skull, but it didn't. It actually got better. And then over the next 9 days, I was able to sit there and open the freezer where it would sit up and look out at me and get out of the freezer and sit there and stare at me and rock back and forth, making these chirpy, squeaky noises, and then starting to put imagery in my head, which at first I thought was an illusion. I thought, you know, I'm just going nuts. But then I realized it was actually taking memories from my mind from when I was a little kid and replaying it back to me just like a movie. But I could smell the grass, I could feel the wind on my arms, from when I was a child, when I was on vacation with my parents. And all these things started to rush into my mind so fast that I had to say, no, slow down, because it was like a fire hose of information. And little by little, he began to learn how much I could take without, being saturated
Right.
with this information. And I mean, this being is truly incredible, too truly intelligent beyond our way of thinking, uh, and yet timid in other ways and very vulnerable in other ways, afraid of humans, and rightfully so. He sees us as a major threat because we can turn on a dime and kill the person that's next to us for $5.
Oh my
You
God,
know,
we're so volatile as a species, and a lot of times people tend to think outwardly in terms of a threat, thinking if there's life out there, it must be a threat to us, not even realizing that we might be the threat to a lot of those civilizations, and it's
exactly,
not that way.
exactly.
But again, going back to that initial experience out in the woods, obviously you're doing your best to gather yourself and calm yourself down, bring yourself to some sort of zero point. At what uh, time did you decide that you were going to bring the body back home? And just to follow up on that question, who was the first person, if you can say in any regard, that you actually confided in to come and view this and be a part of what was going on?
Well, the first person that I called was my girlfriend, and she wasn't home. And then I called another guy that I worked with. He wasn't there. I just left a message for him to call me on his service. And then I called a guy that I had basically grown up with
Mm-hmm.
since high school, a guy named Gary, and said the same thing. I said, Susie's dead. I'm home. I'm really, really sick. Call me. And he did. He called me back in about a half hour. I left that message on his answering machine. This is way back when. And he called and said, what do you need? What can I do to help you? And he believed that my dog had died just by me telling him that. He knew me well enough to hear it in my voice. But when he got there, he obviously didn't believe any of the rest of the story. And I understand that. I totally understand that. Why would he believe it? Well, I happen to have videotape that I played for him in my living room. That tape that I had taken in the woods, the one that you played earlier. And he started to think maybe something did happen, like you're saying. And I said, well, finally, I said, come to the garage, come out to the garage with me. I'll show you. And he thought I was just going out of my mind. And I said, you have to come with me. And I took him to the garage. I opened the garage. This thing set up, started screaming at both of us, and we both ran for the house. I mean, I was hoping it would run away. I was hoping it would go away by itself at that point. But we just sat in the house and looked at each other, numb. And he's the one that came up with the thought, oh, I know what this is, Johnathan, I know what this is. And I'm saying, I don't want to know what it is. I just want to know it's gone. I want to know it's out of my mind or out of my life. And he said, no, this is some kind of alien. And that was the first time I'd heard that said since the beginning. And
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Reed, you also mentioned in the past, I asked you, is it possible this is a time traveler or from another dimension? Because if you could create gravity, obviously things like force field, faster than light travel, all of that, cloaking ability, all of that becomes a possibility. And the way Bob described the sport model, which seems to be the same way things like the gimbal or the tic tac or the Go Fast videos that the Pentagon released all seem to exhibit anti-gravity technology. And I get that gravity might have even been a role in the anchor that you went into, the what other people would say craft, but the obvious
sure,
that's an anchor, which seems to also exhibit that. So, do you think this is an alien that's from the future, or how would you categorize it?
Well, the superiors of this creature are very different. They're energy. They're beings of light. They're big columns of immersing light uh, that undulates up and down, yellow and red and orange. And I've seen them, and they're as much inside of you and I when you're in their beat presence as you could imagine. You don't have to ask any questions because they're already answering them for you.
Mm-hmm.
They are extremely sensitive, extremely benevolent, and caring of us as if we are like a child or an infant that has no ability to understand them. And they realize that. They have created the Freddy character, the one that killed my dog, as a worker to monitor things on our planet. Freddy was born, as I understand his way of thinking, he was born in a under the ocean, in a lab or a base
Which
under the ocean.
which actually makes sense to what
Mhm.
a lot of people have been saying lately, that they are hiding in the ocean. And depending on who you talk to, for instance, Linda Moulton Howe says that the three different prevalent types of ETs, uh, the grays live in the ocean, the reptilians live underground, and I think she said the tall whites, or the third species, maybe the Nordics, live in the mountains. So especially what even Congress has been saying, what you said actually is very plausible.
Well, regarding Freddy is what we took to calling him. Um, he is a created being in the image of his past generations of grays. He is a gray. A lot of people think after looking at the pictures, they think, oh, it's a reptilian. And since it has some characteristics of a sea tortoise, they think, oh, it's a reptilian. Well, it's not. He himself said he is a representation of the gray species. Um, People say, well, where is this from? Where is this origin? Well, the origin is from the Pleiades region and the Orion Nebula area.
Interesting.
So, which I actually have a star chart that he drew, and I've been able to present that to other people who are very knowledgeable and say that it's a backward star chart. It's like looking from their world out toward ours.
That's very curious, and I want to bring up something very quickly that I recall you talking about in a previous interview with Dr. J, and that was that, this wasn't just a one-off. I mean, you had a tumultuous experience with this being, and I'm sure he could say that it probably wasn't much fun for him, at least in the beginning there. But over time, you had forged a relationship, expressing that this extraterrestrial or entity came to see you over 100 times, in the years that went forward.
Yes.
That type of relationship I find to be incredibly unique, of course, for many different reasons outside of the obvious. But, you mentioned that at one point you have tried to forgive him for killing your dog. Do you think that within his limited range of emotional ability, he was able to perhaps forgive you for the attack as well, or even thought of anything along those lines?
I have tried every way possible to get him to understand that I forgive his action toward my dog Susie, because I have come to understand that he was only probably defending himself against something that happened so quickly he was unable to do anything else. It may not have even been a conscious decision by the entity. It may have been his suit that actually was defending him.
Which you go into detail about. actually?
Well, after bringing him home, I tried to cut the spandex material off of his body. I sliced a 6-inch slice with a X-Acto knife, pulling down, straight down to cut it off. And I cut the 6 inches and pulled out the X-Acto knife, and it seared itself right up. It sealed itself like a zipper. I tried to cut it again, and it did the same thing. It resealed itself. The third time I went to cut it, it would not allow the X-Acto knife to cut it, no matter how hard I pulled down on it.
Interesting.
So this material was self-healing. Well, 10 years later, NASA came up with a great idea and said, we've discovered a new self-healing fabric for our spacesuits.
Do you think that could have been a direct result of your experience, even if you don't know the avenue which was taken to get to that point?
No, I don't think it was my experience regarding NASA, but I think the overall concept of a sealing, health-healing fabric is something that they've been looking for a long time, and I'm sure it's back engineering.
I would imagine it would have to be, unless, within some of these secret programs, there is massive progress in terms of the technology. But even when we look back at our own history, and, insofar as what we understand in the most recent history, take the last 200-300 years, and say that there was never a progression in a logarithmic fashion, the way that we've seen technology introduced in the last 100 years. So, of course, when we look at it in that sense, people always say, well, where did we get that idea from? Where did, the inspiration come from that all of a sudden we have X, Y, Z? Well, I mean, considering the world of ufology and the popularity that started to gain a bit of traction, obviously, after Roswell, we know that they were working with alien greys specifically as early as the 20s and the 1930s. And then, of course, progressing onwards with, certain treaties and so forth that we could cite within governments that do have some substantiation. Obviously, we're not able to hold them in our hand, but it's there.
Exactly. There is a researcher somewhere, and for the moment I can't remember his name, but he did a study of human history as far back as he could discern, and including some of what Zachariah Sitchin has researched in the Anunnaki and the Sumerians. And he was able to actually pinpoint different times throughout history. And I'm talking about almost, thousands and thousands and thousands of years history of man's evolution. And there are areas where you can almost see that there was a development that engineered to a certain point of productivity, and then either it failed or somebody wiped it out and started over. And there's like 6 different phases where humans have been engineered and enhanced and made more intelligent, and then all of a sudden it's wiped out by another big flood. And those things are actually substantiated by archaeologists seeing that these different floods happened at different times throughout the history of the earth. And I think that's probably pretty close to being true, that we have been enhanced from time to time, and we are the what shall we say, the project that is never ending, and that there's supposedly going to be another enhancement within humanity coming soon. Now, I don't know the exact date, but I know that we're due to have one.
This is really interesting that you're bringing this up. And one of the reasons for that is that when I started talking about, cultures going back in our history, I was limiting my thoughts, or at least my wording, because that is a very particular concept that comes up all over the place. Now, recently, I've actually made a couple connections when it comes to that specific subject. And I'm going into near-death experiences. I talk to a lot of people who have these experiences, and so many of them come back and they say the exact same thing. We're on the 7th iteration of our experience. And you know, there was a time some years ago, I believe it was in the late 2000s, I came across a video with Duncan Cameron, who was this chief psychic that sat in the Montauk chair in the Montauk Project. And, you know, as a polarizing figure that he is, along with the other whistleblowers, there's always a nugget of truth somewhere, even if they can't expound upon it. And I remember seeing him at a conference, and he was literally saying, we've been wiped out 6 times before, and each time they decide whether it works or doesn't, and if they decide it doesn't, then we go. And apparently the 7th iteration is successful in whatever vision those entities hold in terms of our parentage. So I don't know what that means, but it's really curious that you brought that up, because this was sitting in the back of my mind, not sure whether I should go that route, but you brought it up. So there's
after 28 years of being in the presence of this little intelligent being, and I don't call him a robot because there's too much biology involved just to call him
and
a
he has
robot.
a personality too, right?
Exactly. I have actually been able to understand his personality and share my life with him and his life with me, learning a great deal.
What does that look like, learning about his life and how you share something, again, that's maybe unfamiliar with him?
Well, he basically communicates 99% with telepathy.
Yep. And by the way, folks, if you want to sit here and say telepathy isn't real, doesn't matter if you believe it or not. The governments all believe that it's real and they utilize it. You can look this up. Go ahead, Doctor.
What's the other 10%? What's the other 10% of communication?
Well, he makes gestures and creates imagery that I can see, just like looking at a movie. He's created imagery where I saw where he came from, where he studied as a young lad, shall we say.
Like screen memories, right?
Exactly. But just like totally videos of him walking in a classroom, sitting with others and learning. He also makes these squeaky, chirpy noises similar to what dolphins sound like. But as far as the telepathy, it started out very erratic, where he didn't really understand my voice. I was trying to talk to him like I would talk to my dog or like a small child. But over the years, he's learned what I'm saying. He's learned what my vocabulary means, because I can follow it up with pictures in my mind, which I know he grasps all the time. So we have this ongoing exchange of ideas and information that I think is unbelievably valuable. And I have volumes and volumes of audio tapes sitting with him, listening to him talking to me, and me reiterating what it is he's put in my mind, so that I'm sure, and he can back it up. He can show me whether I'm accurately understanding what he's showing me or not. I've seen pictures of a planet with buildings and landscapes that I know are nowhere on Earth. And it's got to be his home planet. And it's amazing. I mean, it's very modern, very ultra contemporary, I would say, but beyond anything I could conceive. Buildings of glass and marbleine structures, that are enormous, and things like elevators that are just hovering on their own, not linked to anything else. I mean, incredible technology.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you for just a moment here. I want to mention this to everyone very quickly. I would assume, Dr. Reed, that you go into detail about some of this in your book. And I wanted to let people know that there is a book out on your experience that you've authored, and that you can't get this on Amazon Kindle. And I would absolutely recommend that you do. Like Dr. Reed had said, this case has so many different facets to it, and it's so complex that it doesn't matter what angle you come from. There's something to explore. And what he's mentioning now is, I think, more significant than the experience that we initially started on in and of itself. The fact that you can have a relationship like this with another entity that is not familiar to any of us in this regard, biologically or otherwise, really creates a continuity, I think, that a lot of people have questions about in terms of whether we could coexist with these beings. Now, within even what Dr. Reed is saying here, I think overall, in general, we do coexist with them. And yes, we're separated by bands of frequency that we're just starting to understand and be able to quantify. But that being said, we've already had the acknowledgement within scientific communities that these dimensions do exist, and the accessibility of such is really up to whatever we do going forward. And I'm sure there are factions that have the capability outside of what we would already know publicly. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to let people know that you do have a book out, and if you're going into detail about this, definitely pick this novel up and check it out, folks.
And let me just say, this book was co-written by a good friend who became my best friend and who died recently, just a few years ago. Robert Wraith was his name. And he was a freelance writer, and he basically said, after I spoke to him for days and days about what had happened to me, he said, well, we got to start somewhere. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start exactly how it happened, how it went down, and what happened during those 9 or 10 first days. So originally, that's what that book is. We were working on the sequel to this just before he died, which I have to pick back up and get finished. But basically, the first book is on 10 days. The second book will be the last 26, 27 years since, and all that's entailed, all that I've learned by talking to thousands of other people who have had contact all around the world. And look, like I said in the beginning, I don't have all the answers. I just can tell you what I've experienced and what I've learned, which I think has a tremendous value. And I think that's the only reason why I'm alive today. There's been a lot of groups that have tried to silence me, both physically and emotionally, by obstructing my ability to get this story out. People say, why don't you have a website? Well, every time I put up a website, it gets taken down 2 or 3 days later by anonymous sources. Even when I've had a website up in somebody else's name, that they've run it, they've managed it, it still gets taken down. So you have to ask yourself some questions. Why would this be? Why would they, if my case is a hoax, which is what they've spread all over the internet, that I'm not a doctor, that I never went to college, that I never had this experience and it was all fake, if that's true, why do they go to such extreme to silence this information?
Exactly. Why put so much effort, time, and resource into something that isn't real, or there's no threat to that organization or whatever the issue is that they come after you for? I mean, of course, we could surmise that, the public gets wind of this, the cat's out of the bag. Well, yeah, that's probably the case. But the fact is, there shouldn't be a cat in the bag at all. It should be out there for all of us to experience, because what happens with these different factions of, shadow governments and so forth, is that they take all those resources for themselves. And within that definition, they end up living a completely different reality than you and I do, because they have those elements right there in front of them. So they're not experiencing that. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me tell the audience, this video that you're playing now is when I brought the body home. I wrapped it up in the thermal blanket, tied it up with the straps from my pack, and basically carried it back to my Jeep, drove home, and this is when I put it in my garage before putting it in the freezer. Essentially, you'll see me unwrap this. You'll see the entire body. People say, oh, there's no real body. Well, you'll see there's a complete body. And while I was doing this, I was looking through a 1/4-inch viewfinder that was black and white on this little tiny, at the time, 8 millimeter, I guess you call it, video camera. It was one of the very first small ones available. And I wasn't seeing clearly what was happening. If you look at this video several times, you can see that this little guy is actually playing possum. He's not dead, even with the hole in his head, bleeding. He's not dead, but he's pretending to be dead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
you can actually see his eyes.
his eyes and his facial muscles actually move. And in one part of it, when you have the audio up, you can hear the air gasping through his lungs and his mouth when I open his mouth. And I mean, these are things that you can't fake. I suppose you could if you had the right technology and the right materials, but this is just on the floor of my garage.
But people need to remember this is 29 years ago. It's not like today where you could just use AI. And on top of that, there was the proof from Kodak. So we have those two factors, which is why, this stood the test of time almost 30 years later.
And it also, people need to remember, they think, oh, well, what about Photoshop and what about all these? They didn't exist back then. No. None of that existed.
And you're not a practical effects artist. You don't know anything about robotics in this sense. So you don't make props for movies, right?
No.
Right. That'd be a very important thing, an expensive thing to do and try to hoax back then even.
Well, there was a program called Fact or Faked that actually contacted me and wanted to see my story and go through the process. And they did. They went through the process. And then they tried to make an obelisk in the forest. And they pulled out a $15,000 fake alien that they bought, or I don't know how they got it, but they got it from Hollywood, that they said they could make the eyes and the face move. Well, you can make an airplane look like an airplane, too, if you photograph it right, and it's just a piece of balsa wood. But the fact is, it didn't replicate what I did. It wasn't the same. They said it was exactly the same. Well, it wasn't. In fact, they had such bad ratings after that the program basically went off the air because of it. And about 6 months after the program aired, one of their producers, their co-producers, came to me and my team and admitted that the producer of the show and a couple of the people within the show all sought to destroy my case. They wanted to debunk the case, and they tried to do anything they could to debunk it. Saying that I was lying, say that I was, misrepresenting different things. And, I'll tell you the truth. I did misrepresent myself initially. I did change my name to protect my family and what I was going through. And it gave me an additional 4 years of freedom. And, I'm the first one to admit it. A lot of people change their name when they're writing a book. Okay? I mean, and so did I. That's what we decided to do initially, to give us extra time to get the story out. This is the only story that has ever been presented internationally on an international television show where I was able to actually show the Link artifact, which is the bracelet I found next to the body in the woods. It's a metal type of cuff with some hieroglyphs on it.
Yes.
And I had no idea what it was. I picked it up. I put it in the wrapping of the thermal blanket when I brought the body home. You asked me, why did I decide to do that? I don't know. I was going to hide it. I was wanting to hide the body and bring somebody back to help me. And that was my first thought was, okay, I'll hide it under some of this underbrush, and I'll, maybe I can get some branches to put over it and cover it so no animals would get to it. Because basically I saw it as a piece of meat. I thought it was dead, laying on the ground, bleeding. and it wasn't breathing as far as I could tell.
Hmm.
And so I just wanted to hide the body. So I rolled it up in the thermal blanket because I didn't want to touch it. I didn't have any gloves, in the forest, but I rolled it up, kind of put my arms underneath it. And when I did that, I found out that it was so light. It weighed like 40 to 50 pounds only, which was incredibly light. And people say, well, how could that be? Well, birds are incredibly light because they have hollow bones. So I am assuming this might have been very similar to that. And that's a fact.
In certain research, it's been expressed that beings like this, of this nature, they live in a reality where physical exertion is not the foremost way that they get things done. There's no manifestation in that. It's more of a mental thing or something more spiritual that we can sort of understand but barely grasp in its entirety.
Right.
But before we go a little bit further, I know we're getting a little pressed for time here, but I wanted to ask you very quickly, Dr. Reed, would you ever consider releasing the tapes of your conversations with Freddie?
Yeah, I'm sure eventually I probably will.
Mm-hmm.
But without context, they can be distorted. They can become, a 15-second soundbite for somebody's amusement.
Of course.
Because all they end up sounding like is little chirps and squeaks. There is about 5 or 10 minutes of a conversation I had with him on YouTube somewhere, and you can actually hear it. You can hear me talking to him and saying, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm not going to hurt, because he gets very animated and very like alarm went off. He gets afraid of me. And I have to calm him down and say, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to sit right here and it's going to be okay. And you can actually hear the changes and the dynamics of his sounds. This was way back in the beginning.
Dr. Reed, I think it's important that we definitely talk about what happened in Mexico when you were brought down there with a bracelet I believe by Jaime Maussan. The president of Mexico even provided his secret service to protect you, just so the audience, again, understands how serious this case is and how many people take it seriously. And of course, what happened in front of the media cameras.
Well, in 2001, Jaime Maussan, which is basically the Dan Rather of paranormal in Mexico, a major player, well-known television and radio personality, got a hold of one of the people that I call my team and said, who is Johnathan? What is this story? So I flew to meet him and give him the book that we had just published. And his co-producer took the book, read it, and said, Jaime, you have to listen to this. You have to think about this. This case is important, just like Michael, you're saying, for a lot of reasons. And you really need to listen to it. Well, he listened, read the book, listened to it, and 2 days later was trying to make arrangements to get me to come to Mexico, and said that, this case needs to be heard no matter who doesn't believe it. It needs to be heard and understood. And he was very generous. He brought me to Mexico City, brought my team, 8 people, basically secured the top floor of the Fiesta Americana in downtown Mexico City for my team. All the rooms were filled. Other rooms were filled with basically the Presidential Guard with machine guns and repelling gear. They were prepared to blow the windows out and rappel down the side of the building if somebody was going to attack me and or my team. The reason was Jaime and I had received death threats that if I was going on this program with him, that we were going to be killed if we did this. Jaime took this extremely serious, made all the arrangements to have all these people protect me and my team. And we were able to deliver a presentation on a television show that was very much like, what shall I say, like The Tonight Show, but it was international throughout all of Mexico, all of the Spanish-speaking countries in the world, and it was live. And they'd never done it before, but they gave me a full 2 hours to present my material. Jaime showed all the videotapes. They did it in translation, both in English and in Spanish, and it's out there. It's on YouTube. It's called Otro Rollo, and it's an amazing show. I didn't have any idea what they were going to do. Nobody told me ahead of time what it was. I'd never heard of it. But Jaime kept saying, this is an important step. You need to take this step. And I did. And I did the program. And it's, like I say, it's the only international television program ever to show an actual artifact in person where people could see it and look at it. One of the guys that was on the program was from the NASA Ames Institute and looked at the technology, said it was nanotechnology, and he was sure of it, knew what he was talking about. And like I said, an incredible opportunity. But every step of the way, Michael, and I've told this to Dr. J, I've met with huge hurdles where I had to make a decision to either say, yes, I want to do this, or no, I'm going to sit in the basement, covered up with and surrounded by a bunch of guys with guns. Well, from time to time, I've just kept saying, yes, I'm going to do this. No matter what it takes, no matter what happens, I'm going to do this. So in doing that presentation, I did it fully knowing that I would probably be killed afterwards. And I wasn't, but a couple of the people that I work with that were my teammates were killed, thinking that I was with them at the time. And again, this is the situation where death is not something I can joke about because I carry this on my shoulders every day of my life. These people gave their life for me to do this, to present this information because they thought it was valuable. And I thank them.
You came so close to losing yours multiple times because of this.
Well, yes, I have. And that's true. I mean, I've been shot 3 times, actually 4 times. I've been run off the road several times. A couple years ago, I did die, but because of a diabetic coma. And with God's graces, I came back. And I'm here to tell you that there's so much more to be told about this that we haven't even scratched the surface. What I've learned in the last 20 years is that nothing is as it seems. Everything we look at, everything that's out there about extraterrestrial life is very, very little to the real truth of where it's going and where it's come from and why we are a part of it. Some of it is important to learn. Some of it is extremely scary. And I understand why some of this information has not yet been exposed and talked about, because it's going to make great changes in our lives. I mean, we are in some ways going to have to start over and work with these other entities to learn to accept it and move forward and learn from it and keep learning, continually learning that we are not the highest on the food chain. We're probably close to the bottom. But these entities, for whatever reason, say that we are an important part of life, important part of this reality, and that they favor us and they want us to survive. Now, they're not going to stop us from killing each other. They're not going to interfere with our pecking order, but they will interfere if it's the destruction of all of us that could interfere with their agenda. And they have multiple agendas. Like Linda Moulton Howe has talked about, there are different races and different species that look at us differently. We are the long experiment, the ongoing experiment, and we can learn from that, but we also have to learn to pick up the pieces of our own world, of our own society, and learn to accept some things that we haven't yet begun to understand. There's a whole nother side to life besides just our flesh and blood. There's a spiritual side to it that enters into our flesh and blood that nobody is talking about because they get confused. They get confused thinking that somebody wants to be a messiah or wants to be the second coming, and gets too emotional with the facts relating to religion. We need to get beyond that. We need to think of religion as just another example of what somebody felt and what somebody thought at the time.
Yes.
We need a new form of this, which is what I'm now talking about. I'm now talking about the ideas that our lives are not just three-dimensional. They're much more than that. We touch on beings and infinite resonation from our life to other beings throughout the galaxy. And we need to understand that. We need to understand the concepts of telepathy, the concepts of mental imagery that we can pass to each other right now. All we got to do is learn to exercise those parts of our mind to get better with. I've learned a great deal, but all of these things need to be understood. And right now, humanity has a tendency to overload, thinking that we're trying to create a new religion. And that is not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about understanding that life is far beyond, a box. We can live outside of that box. We can gain from the ones who know much more than we do if we just accept the fact and let them into our lives.
I honestly can't think of a better message that you could bring from this. And of course, anybody else that has an experience it's similar, I mean, they have the option to go many different ways. And, for some people, excuse me, that means they may dip into ego. Or, in their interpretation of what they've gone through, there's going to be some misjudgments because, again, all of this is so unfamiliar. But again, your story is so significant, again, for so many reasons, but in respect to the way that it can help people, to at very least give them the courage and bravery to, if not come out publicly about it, be a little bit more at ease in their own life, knowing that, yes, you can get through this and you can survive certain attempts in truncation fashion, what have you, what people are trying to do. There is a light at the end of the tunnel with this. And by and large, these are going to be the stories that generations talk about years from now, wherein they may speak about our time as the darkest age, and how there were some people who were still getting through and making those connections with, the cooperation of other entities and, perhaps celestial parentage. This stuff is not going away, folks. This topic is only going to inflate and grow much larger and eventually encompass us with a more intellectual understanding of what we're actually doing here and those connections that we make with other biological entities that, again, we are not readily familiar with. So,
Michael,
yes,
Michael, let me just say this, and it's people need to seriously think about what I'm saying now. There are people right now that don't believe that the Holocaust happened with the Jews in Germany.
That's right.
We have film. We have people who are alive. We have many hundreds of people who saw it, who witnessed it, that the soldiers that went into the camps and saw it. But yet there are people who are in their 20s now who say it never happened, that say that it was all fake, that it was an illusion, that it was a public, a political tool.
Right.
And if you look at what I'm talking about, it's being exercised the same way, meaning there are people in governments around the world, and I'm not saying just the US government, what we call the dark government, that don't want people to understand that this kind of thing is going on, that there are actually beings that are much smarter than we are, that are much ahead of humanity by maybe 1,000,000 years, but they think we're important to survive. That's the first step to understand. We have to learn from that point on. I had to learn for 28 years to understand, to let this thing into my life, to make sure that I understood every step of the way. And there's a lot of it I don't understand, but I have learned to absorb it and say to myself, okay, I may not like some of this, but I can learn from it. I can elevate myself and those who have gone through these experiences by joining together and creating a mosaic of information that we can build upon. You know, one little piece of the puzzle doesn't tell the whole story. The whole story is all of these pieces put together.
Yes.
And that's what I am attempting to do, is gather strength from people from all over the world, people who have had similar experiences, and talk to them and get their information out as well as my own. We need to learn. We need to open our minds. This is a brand new day for all of us, a new year, a new school, but we need to reach out and absorb some of this information and share with each other, not fight against each other. Look, all I can do is tell you what I've been through and what's happened to me and show you the facts that I have discovered. This is not a stage show. This isn't anything I chose to do. In fact, I much rather had not done this. Like I said, I tried to give this away to several other people to take this, but people like Wendell Stevens, Bob Dean, Dr. John Mack, Donald Ware, Dan McAvoy Sr., all told me this was valuable information that I had to have somebody research and put together in a case file. And that's what's been done. Now, there's also people on the web that say, oh, that was never done. That was never done. Well, officially, from my lips to your ears, it was done. It was a 2-year boots on the ground study where they talked to my family, they talked to people I worked with, they talked to professors who taught me at several different universities. But if you go to those universities and look up my degrees, I don't exist. I don't exist. Like, I never went there. I never participated in it. I never got 3 degrees in them. My education and my employment at the University of Washington Medical School does not exist in computer records or paper records. Now, I ask you the question, who has the ability to erase all that? And why would they do it if it wasn't important?
Exactly. And we come back to that question, one that will certainly stay on our mind until there is some resolve in respect to that revelation. But until then, that's what we're left with. And yet we'll still be progressive within the research and what comes next, because as long as we're still alive, we're still experiencing, and who knows what else tomorrow brings. That's sort of the excitement.
Exactly. In 2023, I was able to present all of my material, all of my evidence, and my presentation to the United States Congressional Panel for the discovery on information related to extraterrestrial life. So it has been certified, it has been verified, and I have gotten some residual compensation. In other words, vindication feels pretty good after 28 years.
I can only imagine what that's like for you and how much you've sacrificed to continue to be able to talk about this, let alone survive, with the duress that you would certainly have following you, whether it's something right in front of you or it's right around the corner. That's going to stress somebody out, and stay right there with them. But
Michael, the
yeah.
sacrifice, the real heroes of this are people like you and Dr. J, who allow me to tell my story, to get this information out. The people who I call Team Reed, who have helped me continue to be able to serve this story truthfully and objectively so that people can understand what it's like to go through it and what you have to do to survive it. I will never quit speaking about this. People have said on the internet, oh, he never speaks, he never talks, he's afraid to talk to people. That's not true. I've gone to 28 countries speaking about this. I've talked on the television, international television, national radio programs, podcasts. I had an invitation by Pope Francis to come and talk with him, which was amazing. He's truly an amazing human being. And one of the questions he asked me is, how can we help them? I just found that amazing.
Might not be what you would expect his first question.
Right, exactly. But truly an inspiration, and there are many people, like the president of Mexico offered me a place to live and an occupation, a journey to work in their hospitals if I couldn't work in the United States. And he thanked me personally after I did the program in Mexico City and said, thank you for bringing this to our people. So incredible to me, just amazing.
But that also leaves me in a state of a little optimism here that, talking about a leader of a major world religion would have something else in mind with, a connection like this outside of an ego move or something along those lines. I have a strong feeling that a lot of those world leaders in one respect or another are aware of what we're dealing with behind the scenes, so to speak. And when they talk to people like yourself, they're actually looking to get to the core in many cases. Now, obviously, this isn't always what we come up against, but at the same breath of the word, we do find it quite often, and we are surprised when we go to speak to somebody on this level and realize that they know more than we ever assumed that they did. But
exactly.
With that being said, Dr. Reed here, we're gonna finish up the show. If you have any last parting words, I mean, you've really just given us so much to work with, not over the whole show, but, even in the last few sentences that you've mentioned here, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you, your presence, your diligence, your bravery, the courage you have to bring this forward and to continue to do it in the face of adversity. It means everything to us. And I can't tell you enough, and I'm speaking for most of us here. We are absolutely honored that you are at the forefront and spearheading what you can do, given what you have been given. And really, this comes down for the betterment of humanity. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for that.
Well, thank you for your ability to help me continue to tell my message to people, to get this truth out. And I'm a God-believing person. I believe in a supreme creator. And I asked this little alien how they felt. And they said, we have belief in one creator, in all of the universes, plural.
Interesting.
And with that statement, I say thank you, thank all your listeners, and I would be honored if you would have me back on again, and
Yes.
We'll go on from this point.
Yes,
because
please.
I have a lot more to tell.
Folks, again, talking about the enormity of this case, I mean, within the 2 hours, just shy of that we've had to speak tonight, we're really only scratching the surface. And we had to breeze over certain details or not go into certain depth for the the sake of brevity. So to hear you say that, Dr. Reed, I mean, I was going to ask you, but I mean, yes, please, we would love to do this again. You know, we'll talk with Dr. J as well, and we'll go down that route. But again, thank you so much for taking the time tonight to sit down and bring this to light, because again, I really think this is going to benefit all of us going forward, even if we can't necessarily anchor all of the details now and make them practical for us. It's still there in front of us for an undisclosed amount of time. So thank you so much.
And it's an ongoing situation.
That's right.
It hasn't ended. This is one of those cases that didn't just happen and then end, and I started talking about it. This has been going on for 28 years and it hasn't stopped. And I don't see that it's going to. I think we've developed a relationship where they somehow feel a value in me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why that is, I'm not sure. But as long as they want to talk to me, I'm willing to listen. And the same goes for you and your audience. If you want me back, I'd be honored. And I thank you for this time. And God bless you.
Well, and same to you, Dr. Johnathan Reed. Thank you once again for coming on. What I'm going to do now is just close out the show, but I'll put you and Dr. J in the green room. If you want to hang out for a minute, we'll say our proper goodbyes. If you have to leave, I understand. Either way, I'll be back there in a moment. And thank you once again, mate.
And hold on. If you guys want to see the other interviews with Dr. Reed, be sure to check them out on my channel. Of course, Mike will put the link in his description, right?
Yes, I thought I did that, but I just realized when you brought it up, I don't think I did. So sorry about that.
There are 2 interviews under the live section. There was a third one that we did live. YouTube struck it down and gave me a strike, forbade me from streaming for a week. So I had to edit it out, that little 10-second statement, and I posted it a couple months ago under the video section.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. And as I close this show out now, I really want to extend a deep, heartfelt thanks to Dr. J Radio Live for orchestrating this interview, doing a lot of the legwork in speaking to Dr. Reed's team, and coalescing what we needed to do in terms of stipulation. Because look, when you have something bona fide, you might come with certain clauses in how you want this presented. And my job here on this channel, as you all know, is to be as thorough, accurate, and transparent as I'm allowed to be with the information I'm given. And when I see that reflected in a guest such as Dr. Johnathan Reed, I know we have something special here. And that's even before we get into the details of his story. So, I mean, for me, being able to sit down and speak to individuals like himself is something that I'm doing for everyone, of course, but at the end of the day, I have my own convictions, and I certainly get a lot out of these that I don't necessarily speak on in public terms. But those of you who speak with me behind closed doors, there are times I'll open up about that. But I just want everybody to know how much an interview like this means to me. And, we cultivate friendships this way. And one of the overriding motifs in Dr. Reed's story is a sense of togetherness and being connected to that all, whether it be a God source or extraterrestrial or something we just don't understand, but we are innately connected to. The fact that this is innate in any sense of the fashion begs us to sit and really think about our connections and place within our universe, and not just the physical universe, but the realities that we are co-creating. Because as we've already understood in many different ways, these extraterrestrials specifically, or interdimensional beings, have already told us that we are this way. And there is a connection. What happens with us happens with them, and vice versa. We're just not entirely aware of it. But it is our responsibility to get to that point. And although I don't think anyone's going to hand us the full truth, it's up to us to find the creativity and the avenues to get to those points of revelation, wherein then we can impart them to the rest of humanity for all to benefit. Folks, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Yes, absolutely. We will have Dr. Johnathan Reed back. Please go and check out Dr. J Radio Live's channel. As he mentioned, those other interviews are on there. And if you enjoyed what we did tonight, I implore that you sit and watch all 3 of those interviews, because there was a lot of information that was locked in and expressed during those interviews that we were not able to get to today, but we'll certainly revisit another time. So until that time comes, when I see you again, which will actually be very soon. I'm not going to tell you what I have planned yet, because it's in the works, but it's coming. probably next week. God, I used to have a tagline here. I don't even remember what it was. Well, I'll rework it as I usually say. In the meantime, everybody, enjoy the rest of your evenings. And thank you so much for being here and joining us. We'll see you next time here on Dark Hour Paranormal. Ciao. Thank you, Mr. Passage, for your $5 donation.